G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I was watching a movie yesterday called Fiddling While the World Burns, and Laura Leela was asking what other people knew about Ukraine. Well, I get ear-fed Laura Leela, and this is ABC Radio National's background briefing. Well, no, Big Ideas I think it is. And this is what I know about the situation in the Ukraine, and this is how I find it out. Radio.
To Big Ideas on RN and online at abc.net.au/RN. I'm Paul Barclay. In the last few days, as you know, the crisis in the Ukraine reached a climax. The Parliament dismissed President Viktor Yanukovych and issued an arrest warrant for him. Yanukovych has refused, however, to resign. While the fighting has stopped for now, the crisis is far from being resolved. It started with the government's decision to axe a trade agreement with the EU, instead accepting an assistance package from Russia. Now the new interim leadership in the Ukraine plans to put the country back on course for European integration, amid concerns of a possible breakup of the nation. Over the past few months, clashes between protesters and state authorities turned increasingly violent, culminating in street fights last week that resulted in the death of 80 people and hundreds of others injured. Tonight, a panel of experts examines the underlying causes that brought the country to near collapse. Towards the end of the discussion, we'll hear more details about the political future of Ukraine. But first, this round-table forum recorded last week before the tumultuous events of the weekend. The expert panellists are Dr. Natalie Doyle, Deputy Director of the Monash European and EU Centre, Professor Leslie Holmes from the University of Melbourne, Jan Pakulski, Professor of Sociology at the University of Tasmania and President of the Australian Institute of Polish Affairs, Professor Marko Pavlichin, Director of the Mykola Zerov Centre for Ukrainian Studies at Monash University, and Stefan Romanov, Chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations and Secretary-General of the World Congress of Ukrainians. This discussion was moderated by Professor Pascaline Vinand, Director of the Monash European and EU Centre, and was presented by the European and EU Centre and the Mykola Zerov Centre for Ukrainian Studies at Monash University.
Stefan Romaniev, you have just returned from Ukraine. Could you please tell us what social or political or ideological groups comprise the Maidan right now?
There are different groups. There are far right, there are people who are more socialist, there are people who are more democratic. To understand Maidan, I think you need to just go back. On the 21st, when the issue of immigration became the issue, there were lots of different people who came together because the focus was Europe. But very, very quickly after the 29th, after the beating of the students, it was no longer the European Union. That was a secondary issue. It was about self-determination. It was about democracy. It was about people saying, we've had enough of this dictatorship. In terms of the different groups, you need to look at the opposition itself, because the opposition has got far right. You've got Svoboda, and then you've got Klitschko, who's of a different fabric, and you've got Yatsenyuk and Batyushchina. Within Batyushchina, you have lots of different groups that make up Batyushchina. It's not an easy task. But one of the prime objectives was to at least get people to speak. And I think slowly they started to do that. People started to realise that three commanders-in-chief you can't have. And I suppose the other point where the ideology and the politics fell right away was Maidan started to speak. So Maidan was not made up about, you know, whether it was this party or that party. It was quite clear saying to its political leaders, you will do what we say. And for example, Yatsenyuk tried to test the waters in terms of saying, well, you know, Azarov's gone. Yanukovych has said maybe we could take over the government. And he tried to test the waters with Maidan. And he got a clear message. You come back here as Premier, we'll deal with you. So Maidan is made up of lots of different people. And what you have today is probably the nationalism, is Ukrainian nationalism is a very strong feeling that people have today. We're fighting, on the other hand, because from the point of view of nationalism, from a Russian perspective, we have that constant hammering that fascists, Nazi supporters and so on. So I'll give you another example, Pravi Sektor, Dmytro Yarosh, who heads up Pravi Saktor, who also heads up Trezub and SOC, which is far right. But the conversations we had with him, we also said to him, you really need to understand that you're part of a team now. You can't just go off and do what you want to do. One of the things that struck me in the last couple of weeks was this. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for blood.
My next set of questions is for Marko Pavlichin and Jan Pakulski. It is commonplace to say that Ukraine is between West and East, or between the EU and the Russian Federation. What does that turn of phrase mean, and to what extent is it true? Where does Ukraine belong in your view? And what was the impact of the Orange Revolution on Ukraine relations with the EU?
This phrase about Ukraine being between East and West, of course, suggests that there's a kind of a deep civilizational divide that runs geographically more or less from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and it separates essentially different ways of seeing the world. On the West you have a Catholic and Protestant-based Western civilization, and to the east of that imaginary line you have a mainly Orthodox Eastern Europe, and on the West you have, according to this perspective, cultures that are friendly to individualism, to democratic governance, to private economic initiative. And on the other side you have cultures that favor collectivism and a rather more authoritarian approach to organizing politics and the economy. Now, Samuel Huntington, who was a major theorist of this view, thought that the fault line between these two civilizations actually runs through the Ukraine. And many commentators today find it quite convenient to agree with him, because it simplifies things. It says that, well, there's a pro-European, Ukrainian-speaking Western Ukraine, and there's a pro-Russian, Russian-speaking Eastern Ukraine. And of course, as with all generalizations, there is a modicum of truth in this, but the detail also, as always, is very, very different from that. For example, the fact that many people in the east and south of the country speak more Russian in their everyday life than they speak Ukrainian doesn't mean that they don't identify with Ukraine. They don't think of it as their country. On the contrary, they have a very particular kind of relationship to it. Nor does it mean that they don't want links with Europe. In fact, opinion polls constantly show that if you put the question about relationships with Europe and the Russian Federation, 2/3 of the respondents typically say that they're looking for closer relations with Europe, and 2/3 of the respondents also say that they feel there is a need for continued close relations with the Russian Federation. And it's obvious that people feel that they live in a country in which they should have normal relations with their neighbors, both to the east and to the west, that they want close ties both with the European Union and with Russia. It's very true that there are many Ukrainian intellectuals and many young people, students, who are ardently pro-European. And that's because of their desire to connect with European intellectual culture, with European civic values, with the cultural heritage of Europe. But they're only a very small part of the very large number of people in Ukraine who simply want a government that observes the rule of law, a government that respects human rights, a country that has free and fair elections, a country that has impartially administered justice. Now, these are the values that we typically call European values. They come to us from the Enlightenment and from humanism before the Enlightenment. And they are part of the European heritage that world culture has received. So from that perspective, if these values are European values, then the great majority of Ukrainians are pro-European. You're asking, where does Ukraine belong? In the sense that Ukrainians want and really should have functioning democratic governance, it should be, of course, in Europe. And at the same time, Ukraine is where it is. Its largest neighbor is Russia. Its major trading partner is the Russian Federation, and not to mention the fact that Russia supplies most of Ukraine's energy. And so Ukraine should have good, normal, neighbourly relations with Russia. And in an ideal world, it would be a Russia that would be as democratic and as European as Ukraine itself.
One of the interesting aspects of current events is that in the last 6 to 10 years, Poland emerged as a major champion of Ukraine's liberation and democratization, ongoing liberation and democratization within the EU. The idea of the Eastern Partnership was hatched by the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Radek Sikorski, in 2008, and he convinced the Swedes to support it and used also a very strong support from the Czech Republic to present it first in Brussels and then in Prague. And this initiative was a very specific example of help, assistance, which reflects also a very warm attitude of Poles towards Ukraine. This warming up of attitudes towards Ukraine in Poland is the result simply of recognition by the majority of Poles that Ukraine faces a problem, a challenge which is not dissimilar to the one which Poland has been facing since 1989. And that the goals which in Poland were depicted, presented as a return to Europe, apply in a similar way also to Ukraine. So Poland's active role within the European Union, championing it against some serious doubts in Germany and France, as a future member of the European community, as a part of Europe which shouldn't be forgotten in the dream started by Schuman, Monet, Adenauer and others, is a very important one. And a model of successful liberation and democratization is another very specific and very valuable assistance to Ukraine. What is this model? I present it as 7 conditions of successful liberation and democratization, successful return to Europe, which only totally accidentally form, the first letters form name Ukraine. So unity of the opposition. The lesson from Poland's struggle, which is relevant for Ukraine, is that the first condition of success is unity of the opposition. If it pulls in different direction, it could be easily defeated. And the principle of divide et impera is very well used by hegemonic powers to the east of Ukraine, south and north. Second is consensus. I know it should be K, but in Ukrainian, I'm sure the name of consensus starts with K, not C. Consensus is essential. By consensus, I mean this type of general, more procedural than substantive agreement of how to disagree. Because, of course, Ukraine, like any society, has a number of different interests. So to act effectively, they need to elaborate the way of agreeing about disagreements. That's consensus. Sort of how to disagree about different problems which need to be solved. R stands for a central institution for finding a solution to the conflict and problem. A round table. Round table. It's the invention of the 1989-90 as an institution in which round refers not so much to the shape of the table around which all important political forces have to sit down to debate, but to the principle of inclusion and no conditions, which is essential for it to be a round table negotiation agreement, which leads us to A, agreement. compromise, has to be coined, forged within the round table. And I, in this Ukraine recipe, stands for immediate electoral act which has to follow round table, to allowing for self-determination to be articulated in the democratic act of fair, free and open election, presidential or parliamentary, but the one which would give birth to the truly national government, executive. And that's N, national government, which should emerge from this agreement, because only the truly national government can face the challenges which Ukraine faces. Massive reforms, dangerous reform, probably leading Ukraine also through the Valley of Tears, similar to the one which all new democracies had to negotiate on the way to Europe. And finally, E, with the help, encouragement and assistance of the European Union. These are the 7 conditions which are not devised, deduced from any ideological model, but they are the results of experiences of successful transition in Poland.
We already have a small round table here, so maybe we'll find some solutions. Marko Pavlyshyn. So Brzezinski-Bomba of 1994, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. But with Ukraine subordinated and subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire, is often brought up in discussions such as this one. What is at stake for Russia on the Maidan politically and economically? Do you think that Russian military intervention is likely? I've just read a Brookings report, just trying to investigate whether this could be the case.
Well, what is at stake for Russia on the Maidan? The question often is put in a kind of an economic and political and, horrible to think, military context. In fact, one of the United States television companies was asking the question of whether, with Ukraine back in its orbit, Russia would be a superpower again. I think that while these are important issues, the main issue at stake for Russia is the question of Russian identity itself. We think of Ukraine as having an identity crisis, but the Russian Federation has one that is no less serious. Now, at many levels, starting with statements by highly placed Russian political figures and officials, and an influential person like Yuri Lushkov, the former mayor of Moscow, comes to mind, right through the respectable media, through the tabloid media, through television, and then into the blogosphere. Time and time again, one finds the phenomenon of Russian commentators being unable to take seriously the fact of Ukrainian independence, or treating it as some kind of oddity or a deviation from the normal course of affairs. And voices which take a different line and say that Russia is a country like other countries and should respect the separateness and identity of its neighbors, including the newly independent states, the successor states of the Soviet Union. They're few and far between. There were, particularly soon after the breakup of the Soviet Union, some eminent voices which said things like this, like the cultural studies scholar Sergei Averintsev. But nowadays, this line of discourse is practically inaudible in Russia. So it seems that, for whatever reason, and the historical argument here would be long, and I don't want to enter into it, many Russians simply aren't willing to accept the fact of Ukrainian independence. And the foreign policy of a resurgent Russian Federation has actually reflected that cultural groundswell. And this has been clear in the kind of pressure that was brought to bear on the Yanukovych government to derail the signing of the association agreement with the European Union, and the equal and opposite pressure for Ukraine to join the customs union dominated by the Russian Federation instead. So there is, I think, a kind of an issue of identity that is at stake here that is crucial. And then there's the issue of the personal prestige of President Putin. Putin has enjoyed a sequence of extraordinary successes in the last 12 months. John Bessemeers, an Australian commentator at the Australian National University, has called the last 12 months Putin's miraculous year, his annus mirabilis. He seems to have outmaneuvered the United States over Syria. He's had a windfall with the Snowden affair. The staging of the Sochi Olympics is a kind of an extravaganza that he takes very personally as reflecting on the power of Russia and therefore his own personal standing. And, you know, the Putin win against the West and against NATO over Georgia isn't so far in the background. The present circumstances are a kind of an opportunity for Putin to recover from the embarrassment and the loss that the Orange Revolution had been for him. The Orange Revolution produced the opposite result to what Russian political technologists, as they're called, had been planning for, the installation of a government very friendly to the Russian Federation in 2004. So the current events in Ukraine and the desired outcome, the imposition effectively of economic control over Ukraine, would surely be a neat conclusion of this decade since the Orange Revolution for Putin.
How important is Europe for the protesters on the Maidan and their supporters? The decision not to sign the association agreement sparked the current protests, but is it still a relevant issue? What does Ukraine represent for the EU? And finally, is there ever a chance of Ukraine joining the EU? Perhaps Natalie Doyle could start on this one?
There's a lot to cover. I think it's useful to go back to the Eastern Partnership that's been mentioned a couple of times, and to the history of it, which was this relationship, a framework for relationship between the EU and so-called post-Soviet states, not only Ukraine, but also Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, and Moldova. I suppose what I want to stress, because it echoes some of the issues which Marco has already mentioned, is the fact that the European partnership was never very well defined. And as a result, the European Union itself is divided on its significance, right? And that complicates tremendously the question of how the EU is supposed to deal with the current Ukrainian crisis. And of course, the historical background to this was the enlargement of the European Union to the east, to incorporate countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, which obviously became the Czech Republic, Hungary, and so on, which was planned in parallel with the enlargement of NATO. And that led to the conceptual lines, if you want, between regional integration, economic integration, and security objectives to be blurred, the two never being totally distinguished. This has not been resolved still. So that, I suppose, connects with what security experts call the security dilemma, right? Which means that obviously for the countries that used to be previously were under Soviet domination, the Eastern Partnership was perceived, in fact, as a security measure as well, right? Not simply a measure to facilitate economic modernization, democratization of those countries, but also something that was actually going to strengthen the European Union in its relationship to Russia. That security dilemma, if you want, right, which was, to what extent could the European partnership fulfill that function? To what extent, there was a real need to strengthen the European Union as against a potential threat coming from Russia, I suppose produced what some commentators have called the integration dilemma for a country like Ukraine, which Marco alluded to, because there was a kind of game of upmanship between two schemes of economic integrations that were proposed, which was the one which was the European Union, and the European Partnership, in fact, never actually promised membership of the European Union. It was always very ambiguous, right? But obviously it was perceived by many of those countries, and most of all Ukraine, as a promise of eventual membership, but it was never actually meant to be that. And a rival scheme, if you want, that was set up by Russia, which was the Eurasian Foundation. And so then obviously Ukrainian society was summoned to make a choice between the two, right? In terms of the response of the European Union, that is the problem. And of course, beyond that is the question of the relationship of the European Union to the United States, because the United States have put their own interpretation on the situation in Ukraine, and the way they would like to see the issue resolved. And in some quarters of, obviously, the circles making those decisions in the United States, it is presented as a zero-sum game, and it's encouraging the European Union to actually become much more vocal. Now, of course, the recent events have changed things totally, right? And it is clear that the EU is going to proceed with some sanctions, some form of sanctions. But I think many European leaders, and that includes Angela Merkel, who sees, in fact, the leadership in relation to the management of the Ukrainian crisis, there is this concern that, and there is this awareness that they don't want to be caught up in a situation where it becomes a rivalry Russia, United States, and the European voice gets forgotten. The capacity for the European Union to decide on its own foreign policy gets lost.
You're with Big Ideas on RN and online at abc.net.au, and a discussion about the origins of the Ukrainian crisis, the country's political culture and geopolitical orientation, moderated by Pascaline Vinand. On the panel, Dr. Natalie Doyle, Professor Leslie Holmes, Professor Marko Pavlichin, Stefan Romanev, and Professor Jan Pakulski, who continues now with another look at the role of the EU.
The very original dream of unified Europe, produced by Schuman, Monet, Adenauer, and others, included the right of every member of the European family, every country in Europe, to access the European Union, but on certain conditions. So the path of Ukraine to Europe is not a matter whether Ukraine will or will not, but whether Ukraine will declare the willingness to join the European Union and fulfill the conditions of entry. The danger is that such voluntary joining of the European Union is interpreted quite differently by Russia. The Russians are seeing Europe as a sphere of influence, which is not the intentions, not a plan. It's simply a vision from Moscow, which would like to maintain the notion of near-abroad spheres of influence, which limited sovereignty during the Soviet period. There is no return to such vision. It's an issue which divides very seriously political visions from Moscow and from Brussels and other countries. Ukraine...
Okay, here endeth part one.